Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's my great honor and pleasure today to introduce our renowned speaker, Dr. Hecker, a highly distinguished nuclear scientist and policy expert who has had decades of experience in the nuclear field, especially fostering cooperation with the Russian and Chinese nuclear laboratories to enhance the safety and security of their nuclear assets. Dr. Hecker spent 34 years at the Los Alamos National Laboratory beginning in 1965 and became the fifth director of the laboratory from 1986 to 1997. He served as a senior fellow at Los Alamos until 2005, where he joined when he joined Stanford University as a professor and researcher in the Department of Management Science and Engineering, as well as senior fellow at the Center for International Security and Cooperation. After retiring from Stanford in August of this year, Dr. Hecker has joined the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey as professor of practice and the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies. Dr. Hecker, we are very glad to have you speak with us today. Thank you very much, and please take it away. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's my great pleasure, and I guess I just say good very early morning to some of you, good evening, or maybe late night for some of the rest of you. So as for me, it's reasonably early morning. I'm sitting here in a hotel room by the San Jose airport, ready to fly back home to New Mexico. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico these days, close to Los Alamos, and I just spent a week out here in Monterey with my new colleagues. So it's indeed my great pleasure, and I spoke a little bit with Professor Vassilieva yesterday and with Alternate as to how I could sort of aim my remarks in a way that would be useful to what you're doing in the trialogue, recognizing that the idea is to make sure that we can continue to foster cooperation among, in this particular case, of course, the U.S. or the Western world, let's say, and Russia and China. And so, and since, you can tell from my background, I'm sort of the nuclear guy. And from what I could see, you haven't had much nuclear focus so far. And so I thought I would indeed do just that, is sort of the focus on the nuclear world. And particularly to focus on the fact that my firm belief is in the nuclear world, we need cooperation. We need cooperation in order to get the best out of the nucleus. In other words, the nuclear power and the nuclear technologies, while avoiding the worst, and that is the risks and the dangers associated with these technologies. And the reason it's so important in the nuclear world, because when you split the nucleus, you get a factor of millions of energy release compared to what you typically get. Whether you burn fossil fuel or you blow up TNT, it's electrons that matter. And when you split the nucleus, you're talking about a factor of millions. So that factor of millions then has along with it the enormous potential benefits. But at the same time, it has these great risks. And so good part of my career has been aimed at how do we get the best and avoid the worst. And that's particularly what I'm dedicated to now. So I not only, after the retirements that were already mentioned, not only associated with the Monterey Institute and the Center for Nonproliferation Studies, but also Texas A&M University, and particularly the Department of Nuclear Engineering. And the reason that I do this, let's say at this particular, not such a young age, is to be able to work with people like you. And so that's what really motivates me. So in thinking about these remarks, what I thought I would do is sort of go back to emphasize the importance of cooperation, is go back to how it started. Of course, the nuclear world as such started with the Manhattan Project and the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945. and then the Soviet Union detonated, its first nuclear device in late August of 1949. By 1953, the newly elected president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave a speech on December 8th at the UN General Assembly and essentially launched what we called Atoms for Peace. And what he was looking for is to say, look, can we harness, the power of the atom for the good of mankind rather than for the destruction of mankind? That became known as Atoms for Peace. It was interesting. The Soviet version of that, they were somewhat reluctant in the beginning to join this effort because they thought surely the Americans had some trick up their sleeve. But they then also joined and called it the Peaceful Atom program. And so that began, and the idea was for the nuclear powers at that time, and by that time it was the United States and the Soviet Union, but also the UK, and that is Great Britain, because they had detonated their first atomic device in 1952. So they joined together in cooperation in their own way. The U.S. in its own way with the countries it wanted to work with, and the Soviet Union with sort of the Eastern Bloc country, in order to bring the benefits of nuclear power to these other countries. And that meant nuclear power as well as nuclear research and nuclear medicine. And then they also recognized right from the beginning, in fact, it was recognized immediately after the Second World War by Robert Oppenheimer, who was the first director of Los Alamos, and his colleagues, that in the end, one has to work these issues jointly and internationally because, as they said, the sort of the technology for nuclear technology for bombs and for peaceful applications, for the most part, interconnected and interdependent. And so then they started working with the United States and also the Soviet Union towards controlling the dangers of things nuclear. And that then resulted in the establishment of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Administration Agency in Vienna in 1957. And then from that standpoint on, they just sort of worked, the Soviet Union its way, the United States in its own way, to try to limit the number of countries that would develop nuclear weapons. In other words, to work to sort of harness the potential for nuclear proliferation, and also, as I said, in their own way, help to spread nuclear power into countries around the world. And so that cooperation then, even though it wasn't, really tight cooperation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, nevertheless, it existed. And it was very important. And it was really important that both of them believed that one had to have the strictures associated with trying to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons and problems related to safety and security of nuclear weapons. At the same time, though, while the two countries were doing that, they were also in an arms race with each other. And they build up their nuclear arsenals enormously. And initially in the 50s, the Americans, in terms of numbers, were far ahead of the Russians. By 1965, the Americans actually started to sort of taper off in the number of nuclear weapons. In 65, 67 is when the U.S. nuclear weapons sort of reached the maximum. And the Soviet Union was catching up. And indeed, they continued and then surpassed the Americans to where at one point, sort of as best as we know, the Soviet Union had about 41,000 nuclear weapons. Now, if you think about that in today's world, I mean, that's just, it seems outrageous. and the U.S. had 25,000 or so, 26,000 nuclear weapons. And it's not that the U.S. gave up on the arms race. It's just they started to focus much more on the precision of the missiles rather than having lots more missiles and having larger and larger, nuclear warheads. So they were certainly keeping up their end of the arms race. And so the two of them continued to arms race. However, they also recognized that it can't be unbounded. And so they started as early as the 1950s, the late 1950s, to talk about, should we control nuclear tests? Nuclear tests are essentially the ways that you increase the sophistication of the nuclear arsenal. In other words, to test and to convince yourself that you can take whatever the next step might be. And so Soviet Union and the Americans worked together to limit nuclear testing. And particularly that was very important in the 1950s when the technology changed from the atomic weapons, and that is what we call fission weapons that you get by splitting the nucleus, to the hydrogen bomb, to thermonuclear or fusion weapons. And those were first brought in 1951, 52, and then there were several huge explosions in the 1950s, and essentially all of these were done as atmospheric nuclear tests. And so they spread radioactivity all over the Northern Hemisphere. And as you might imagine, that got a lot of public outcry. And the US and the Soviet Union responded to that. Initially, they had a short, complete testing moratorium, 1958 to 61. Soviet Union broke out of that, and actually, at one point in 1961, in late October, they detonated what is the largest nuclear device ever, and it was actually 100 megaton device that was detonated at half yield. At half yield because Andrei Sakharov was able to convince Khrushchev that, look, we shouldn't. Actually, he didn't want to detonate it at all, but Khrushchev said, no, we're going to do this. And so at Novaya Zemlya, this hydrogen bomb device at 50 megatons, in other words, 5,000 Nagasaki's, if you can even think about that. And that, again, that combination of the Americans setting off hydrogen bombs, the Soviets setting off hydrogen bombs, had enormous public outcry. And in 1963, then, the two countries, along with the UK, then agreed to limit all future nuclear testing to underground only. No more atmospheric, nothing below the ocean, nothing in outer space. So that's called the Limited Test Ban Treaty. The reason I mentioned that, and then there were several other treaties. Eventually, they also had a threshold test ban treaty that even underground the limit the total size of the blast. I tell you this to say that all along there was a dialogue, there was cooperation. They also then agreed to limit the missiles. So there was a SALT treaty, strategic arms limitation treaties, and then eventually a START treaty, and that is a reduction treaty. But nevertheless, the arsenal still grew until the late 1980s. And then we had the combination, which of course you know very well, and many of you know much better than I do, of Gorbachev, coming to head the Soviet Union, and Ronald Reagan as president of the United States. And so between the two of them, then sort of the seminal event, at least from my perspective, was the Reykjavik summit, where they got together and they actually talked about eliminating nuclear weapons. So we had that sort of dialogue, that sort of cooperation. By the way, that's also when I sort of came into the political or policy scene, because I became director in January of 1986, and by October of director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. And by October of 1986, our two presidents got together and said, look, let's eliminate nuclear weapons. I still remember sort of chuckling, how's that for job security? Leading a nuclear weapons laboratory. And these guys said, why don't we just get rid of them? So that was fascinating. Of course, they didn't get rid of nuclear weapons, but they did agree that we should actually do what we call joint verification experiment. They were actually experiments at each other's nuclear test sites in order to be able to ratify this threshold test ban treaty, which limited the nuclear explosion to 150 kilotons. And so that's where I then came into play. We did a nuclear test in Nevada underground, and we invited the Soviet scientists to come and to do on-site measurements. And that was my first introduction to the Soviet nuclear scientists, nuclear weapons scientists. And it was an awakening because as we worked together, talked together, celebrated the fact that, quite frankly, our test worked and they were able to make the measurements to demonstrate that the on-site measurements were the same as off-site seismic measurements, which allow the verification. In the end, my conclusion was that looking across the table in the control room or afterwards in what's called the Mercury Steakhouse, celebrating, I said, they're just like us. They are doing this for the security of their country, and we're doing it for the security of our country. So that's the sort of cooperation that existed even during U.S. and Soviet days. And then, of course, came in very quick succession the dissolution or the breakup of the Soviet Union. And that changed the nuclear order greatly. So until that time, sort of my view, my contention is we did wind up having a global nuclear order. And that global nuclear order through the rest of the world might have considered us, the United States and Soviet Union, as irresponsible states, for building tens of thousands of nuclear weapons, and of course going through crises like the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in the end, our view was that, look, we've now, from the time of 1945, now into 1985, so you're talking about 40 years, we've had no more use of a nuclear weapon. So in other words, sort of what was developed was what I call the no-use norm for nuclear weapons. Some people, say that that's indeed the case. So we had no-use norm. We also, in spite of the fact that we were concerned in the 1950s and 60s that perhaps we would have dozens of states go nuclear, in other words, nuclear weapons. And by the way, several dozen states at one time or another did follow some aspect of a nuclear weapon program. But by 1985 timeframe, we had less than 10 states with nuclear weapons. And I also considered that's part of the global nuclear order. And then remarkably, we had no nuclear use by terrorists, no mushroom cloud, from a terrorist attack. In fact, not even a dirty bomb, that is spreading radioactivity. So that's three: no use of nuclear weapons, reasonably limited nuclear proliferation, no use by terrorists, and then because of these peaceful atom programs, nuclear electricity was providing more than nuclear power was providing more than 10% of the electricity in the world. And particularly, as you can imagine, in today's world, it was 10% of clean electricity, very, very little carbon. And in addition, even more so, it was nuclear medicine developed during this time. And actually, by today, there's some 40 million nuclear medical procedures a year around the globe, either for diagnostics or for treatment. So as I look at that, even then at the end of the Soviet Union, or even let's say by this year, at least early this year, there was this global nuclear order that even though, people, let's say in the global South would say this is terribly discriminatory, particularly the way the Non-Proliferation Treaty said there are 5, states that are allowed for the time being to have nuclear weapons, the ones that tested before 1967, in other words, US, Soviet Union, China, UK, and France. Even though that's terribly discriminatory, nevertheless, people like me look at this and say, it could have been so much worse, and we've gotten quite a bit of good out of that. However, that whole order then changed dramatically with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And that is before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Our concern, of course, in the US and let's say in the West, were indeed the nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet government, the 41,000 or so nuclear weapons, the enormous amount of nuclear material. And with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it changed dramatically to say, no, we're not worried about that anymore. What we're worried about now is the nuclear weapons or the nuclear assets getting out of the hands of the Soviet government and its successor states. And particularly, of course, at that time, actually 4 states inherited nuclear weapons: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And so our job changed, and that it will eventually be shown as to being a most incredible period in human history of how these two countries, then Russia and the United States, worked together to limit that threat. In other words, to make sure there was no disaster when the Soviet Union blew up, had an economic meltdown, that a nuclear disaster didn't occur. And that's where, the American government stood up, and I was very proud of them. The Russian government, demonstrated indeed how dedicated it was to making sure it could do everything possible that a disaster didn't happen. And so that was the greatest period of cooperation. So the 1990 was sort of the golden era of nuclear cooperation between the United States and Russia. And again, on the sides, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and Belarus, but particularly with Russia. And that's when I began working directly. I was still director at Los Alamos, and I would work with my counterparts in the Russian Los Alamos, as we call it, in the city of Sarov. The Institute, Viniev, they call it, the Institute of Experimental Physics. We had 2 main nuclear weapons laboratories in the United States, Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore. And of course, the Soviets also had 2. One was in the city of Snezhinsk in what they call the Institute for Technical Physics. I asked them, what's the difference? Why is one experimental? Is one really experimental and one tech? They said, no, we just had to find a different name. And so we called one that and the other technical. So the way you can believe how well we worked together just before everything went downhill, which it did in the 20-teens. I was able to convince my American and Russian colleagues to write up what we did together, and we did that in a 2-volume book, 1,000 pages, called "Doomed to Cooperate." And it's titled appropriately because we really did feel if we did not cooperate, what happened with the dissolution of the Soviet Union would doom us all. And the Russians wrote up their experience, what they did, why they did so, and we on the United States did also. And so the reason we did that, the challenge that we faced is sort of what I call the 4 loose nukes problem. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Loose nuclear weapons, in other words, the safety and security of those nuclear weapons. loose nuclear materials. As you probably know, we call them fissile materials. The bomb materials are either plutonium or the isotope uranium-235. Those are the two things you can make a bomb of. Hiroshima was uranium-235. Nagasaki was plutonium. And it only takes, for plutonium, it takes around 6 kilograms. Only a grapefruit size of plutonium is what blew up Nagasaki. So it doesn't take much. For highly enriched uranium, it takes, let's just say, a few tens of kilograms. And the Soviet inventory was somewhere on the order of 1.4 million kilograms of these materials, about 150,000 kilograms of plutonium and the rest highly enriched uranium. Now, if you just think about the security, the safety of that material in this big, sprawling Soviet Union, where they didn't use the sort of modern techniques that we did for safeguards and security. They didn't have to, because, it was enough of a police state in terms of guarding those facilities, those places. I used to call it, sort of jokingly, they had a system of guns, guards, and gulags. And they had, as you look back, they had an admirable record of nuclear materials security. But the world changed. And then people, I call it loose people. That's what the Americans and President George H.W. Bush were actually most worried about, is what's going to happen to their nuclear specialists as they're not eating, because the economy had imploded. And they had at least a couple of 100,000 in the nuclear weapons part of the program and 1 million in the total nuclear program. And then there was the problem of potential loose exports. Will the facilities, will the country sell any of those? To make a long story short, from this 2-volume book is what we demonstrated together, the Russians and the Americans. Essentially, the 4 loose nukes didn't happen. There were no loose nuclear weapons. There was a little bit of nuclear material leakage in the 90s, but remarkably little. In terms of people, almost nothing. There are few indications of some nuclear help, perhaps with Iran, but it was tiny compared to the potential that was there. And then in terms of exports, it turns out for the Soviet Union and Russia actually became a responsible nuclear state. And actually the Soviet Union by itself was already, they never sent this stuff out to other places. When they worked with the Eastern Bloc, they made sure those countries had control. So at any rate, we managed to get through that terrible time of the breakup of the Soviet Union by working together, and the best days were in the 1990s. We continued into the 2000s, but then and let me just say, during this time, as you might gather from my comment, I took this stuff really seriously, because that's what I thought was the biggest nuclear threat in the world at the time. And so I went to Russia a lot. I first met them in 1988 in Nevada with these joint verification experiment. I first went there in 1992, actually to their Los Alamos, inside of the secret city of Sarov and also of Snezhinsk. And up until December of 2019, I've been there 57 times. In those 57 times, working all the time with Russian nuclear colleagues in the direction that I just indicated, including also not just taking care of the nuclear risks, but taking care of doing the good things. Again, what the Russians wanted to do, and let me just tell you, the Soviet nuclear enterprise, or the Russian nuclear enterprise, their people were superb, absolutely scientific, technically superb. And they, just like our people, they wanted to do research. They didn't just want to avoid the bad. They wanted to do good. So they wanted to do research. And then they had this enormous drive. They were much even more convinced than we were that nuclear power is going to save the world and that it was important. So we worked together on all of those things, and those were the 57 trips. However, I would say from about 2001 on, I could tell, whereas the 90s were sort of the great days, and things became more and more difficult. I was a bit more. I used to run in the secret city of Sarov, and I still remember. The guards would be out there, and I'd say, "Well, look, you can come run with me." They said, we don't want to do that." And so at one time they would say, "Well, yeah, we know where you're going to go. Are you going to go on the same route?" And I said, "Yes, of course I'm going to go on the same route." But anyway, I had significant freedom. The freedom started to be restricted more as we got into 2006, 5, 6, 7. Actually, one of the warnings there was Putin gave a speech in February of 2007 in Munich. And that was sort of the first time that I really recognized that hey, they're thinking about things very differently. And he talked about American exceptionalism and the concerns that he had. Now, by that time, that also followed the fact that the Bush administration, when it took over from the Clinton administration, withdrew from the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, early in the 2000s. And that was very upsetting to the Russians from a standpoint of sort of where it put them in their view of sort of strategic stability, vis-a-vis the United States. And even though we were still working together with them in 2008, 9, 10, and 11, and in fact, in 2010, when Dmitry Medvedev was president, they actually signed, one more nuclear treaty, the so-called New START treaty. But very soon after that, then the relations really deteriorated. That was sort of, an exclamation mark was put on that with the annexation of Crimea and the move into eastern Ukraine. And that's pretty much when our direct cooperation between the nuclear weapons laboratories on the two sides stopped. So in 2014, the Russians said, thanks for your help, and we're done. I should say along the way, some of the other programs that were just absolutely exceptional in terms of cooperation. As I mentioned, Russia had so much fissile materials, which now was clearly excess. And the US also had excess. But in highly enriched uranium, the two countries struck up a deal that 500,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium would be taken from highly enriched uranium state and mixed with natural uranium to move the percentage down to 3 to 5%, which is what you need to power nuclear reactors. So in other words, that makes reactor fuel rather than bomb fuel. And so we, the Americans, then paid the Russians to do the downblending over there. They took their weapons grade material, downblended it, sold it to the Americans, and we burned it and still are burning it today. So sometime in the 2000 late teens, 18, 19, 20, 10% of the American electricity actually came from Russian former bomb fuel. That's just a fantastic story. So that's where we were with Crimea, eastern Ukraine. That started to go down. And then the situation, continued to get difficult. The Americans withdrew from one treaty. The Russians pulled back from other things, and then so we're now going, moving up into let's just say 2019, when I was no longer able to work directly with my Russian colleagues in the Russian nuclear weapons enterprise. Then I decided I would go down essentially to the next generation, like you. And I began with my Russian colleagues at MIFI, at Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute. I began a program I called Young Professional Nuclear Forums. So we'd go back and forth between Stanford and MIFI, and we worked together at the next level to tackle various nuclear issues. Okay, then all of that, came to a screeching halt with the invasion of Ukraine. And my concern, I did an interview with the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists within 3 to 4 weeks after that invasion, is to say, look, now we've really blown up that global nuclear order that I mentioned, the 4 big things. And how are we going to rebuild that global nuclear order? And in essence, that's what I'm going to put into your laps, because it's going to have to be rebuilt by people like you. So I know I've gone on probably just about at my time limit, but I've focused so much so far on Russia. And of course, this is a trialogue and not a dialogue. And so let me just say a few minutes worth. I've essentially done all of the same things also with my Chinese nuclear colleagues. So after I went to Russia in 1992, I went to China in 1994. And I went to the Chinese Los Alamos, as we called it, at Minyang, in the Sichuan province. And I began to work with my Chinese colleagues. Again, all in the same vein. How do we make sure that we keep nuclear security? How do we keep a dialogue from a standpoint of sort of strategic stability? How do we avoid nuclear terrorism? For instance, when Beijing had the 2008 Summer Olympics, I thought they were quite ill prepared for the potential of radiological terrorism. And so when I first started working with the Chinese colleagues on this issue in 2006, they said, it can't happen in China. And I said, no, you can't say that. Because, for example, right across your border is Kazakhstan. In Semipalatinsk is a place I visited many, many times, and there were lots of nuclear problems in Semipalatinsk. And so how do you know that stuff isn't coming across your border? So I worked with the Chinese. So I've been in China 39 times, all in the same spirit. And for the last 10 years, I similarly worked. So this young professional exchange between the Chinese on their side with their nuclear weapons seniors, and then on our side with our young and our established. So the challenge that we face today, and the one that I leave for you, is if the invasion of Ukraine has really blown up the nuclear order, are we going to have the potential of nuclear use, for the first time in 75 years? That would just destroy all those things we've put together. The Zaporizhzhia, taking over a nuclear power plant, again, is so totally against the grain of everything that we've tried to do in the nuclear world that then, we worry about state-sponsored nuclear terrorism. How about the civilian world? Russia was the major supplier of enriched uranium for nuclear power plants around the country, having the capacity of like 35% of the total world's capacity. And of course, they had reactor contracts around the world. Where's China going to play? China was way down in terms of the capabilities for nuclear power reactors until 2000 or so. And it's moved up gradually and steadily. And actually, it's another great sign of American-Chinese cooperation in the safety of nuclear power plants and for safeguards also. And so I've worked those issues with the Chinese. So we've done that. How we're going to rebuild that global nuclear order, I don't know. But I'm going to stop here and let you ask questions. So thanks for your attention.